The tariffs impact the country, but what about this province? Let's go to Provincial Affairs reporter Michelle Bellefontaine to take us through Alberta's reaction. Michelle, let's start with the Premier.
Well, Nancy, while most provincial premiers held news conferences about the tariff today, Premier Danielle Smith made one media appearance, and it was on the U.S. cable network CNBC. Smith said she was very disappointed the tariffs were here and that people on both sides of the border will get hurt.
We've addressed every issue that was raised about the border. As issues have been raised, we've been solving them, and yet new issues keep on popping up, which suggests that we've got a president that actually doesn't want a deal, and that's a problem. And so what that means is that we have to be prepared that this might not just be a 1 week problem or a 1 month problem. It might be a 4-year problem, and 4 years is a long time.
Smith also said she doesn't want restrictions on oil and gas exports. Now, in a written statement sent later, Smith called the tariffs foolish and said that she supports the federal government's response. She said it's time to tear down provincial trade barriers and to unite as a province and a country. Now, there were no other media availabilities from Smith today, no interviews with Canadian outlets. We're told she's planning a news conference tomorrow in her Brooks Medicine hat riding. She said she is meeting with her cabinet today and tomorrow to discuss how Alberta will respond, and those details will be announced tomorrow. Now, the NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, put out a statement chastising the Premier for her efforts to talk to Trump at Mar-a-Lago and for attending the inauguration in Washington. He accused her of not having a plan to deal with the tariff impact and said she's hiding today, trying to pull something together at the last minute. But there's no news conference for him today either, and he's waiting until Smith talks tomorrow.
So a lot going on in this province, obviously. What about what other premiers are saying?
Well, in contrast with Smith, many other premiers, like, for example, every premier in the Atlantic Canada, the premiers of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and BC, they all spoke out today. Most of those provinces are taking measures like pulling U.S. products out of their liquor stores, banning or putting higher costs on American companies bidding on contracts in their provinces. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said he is tearing up Ontario's controversial contract with Starlink, Elon Musk's internet venture, and he's also threatening to impose a 25% charge on electricity going to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota if the tariffs persist, and maybe even cut that electricity flow entirely.
So, Michelle, do you get any sense of where we go from here?
Well, last week's provincial budget laid out 3 scenarios. There was a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, and then the base case scenario, which the budget was actually based on. Still hard to say at this point which one will apply. It depends on how long the tariffs will last. Now, we talked to Greg Anderson. He is a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. He specializes in Canada-U.S. relations. You'll recall that Smith faced a lot of criticism for going to Mar-a-Lago and to Washington, but Anderson says that trip wasn't such a bad idea.
The fact that it didn't pay off doesn't mean that it wasn't useful. The fact that you can't tie that strategy to something specific in terms of a policy change doesn't mean it was necessarily a waste of time or a useless effort, because it may pay dividends down the road. That connectivity, maintaining those.
For decades, the economic relationship between Canada and the United States has been defined by integration rather than confrontation. Energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and raw materials flow back and forth across the border with a level of interdependence unmatched anywhere else in the world. This system evolved not by accident, but by geography, infrastructure, and mutual necessity. When tariffs enter that system, the consequences rarely stop at the border where they are imposed. That reality became clear when U.S. tariffs aimed at protecting domestic industries collided with Canada's most powerful economic asset, energy. Alberta sits at the heart of that asset. The province holds the world's third-largest proven oil reserves, vast natural gas resources, and a network of pipelines, refineries, and export infrastructure that binds it tightly to the U.S. economy. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are optimized to process Canadian heavy crude. Changing that supply is neither quick nor cheap. When tariffs were introduced on Canadian goods under the banner of economic protection, the assumption in Washington was that Canada would absorb the pressure. The reality was more complicated. Tariffs disrupted pricing signals, increased costs for manufacturers, and triggered retaliation across multiple sectors. While energy was not always the direct target, it remained the backbone of the economic relationship. Any disruption to trade flows inevitably touched Alberta. Instead of collapsing under pressure, Alberta adapted. Canadian energy producers shifted contract structures, diversified export routes, and leaned into the fact that U.S. demand for Canadian energy was not optional. It was structural. American refineries could not simply replace Alberta's supply without massive capital investment and long-term planning. This imbalance created leverage. While tariffs increased costs for some Canadian exporters, they also raised prices for U.S. consumers and manufacturers. Steel, aluminum, auto parts, and machinery all became more expensive. Energy costs filtered through supply chains, amplifying inflationary pressure. The political narrative framed tariffs as a show of strength. Economically, they revealed dependence. Alberta's oil and gas sector did not respond with dramatic countermeasures. There were no sudden shutdowns or embargo threats. Instead, the province continued supplying energy while market forces did the work. Prices adjusted, costs accumulated, and U.S. industries felt the pressure. Refineries in states like Texas, Illinois, Ohio, and Louisiana faced higher input costs. Fuel prices fluctuated, manufacturing margins tightened. For industries operating on thin margins, even small cost increases mattered. The backfire was not immediate, but it was measurable. Economic data showed that U.S. companies bore a significant share of tariff costs, either directly or through higher input prices. Studies later confirmed what businesses already knew. Tariffs functioned as taxes, and those taxes were often paid domestically rather than abroad. Alberta's position within this system gave it unusual resilience. The province had already endured years of volatility from global oil prices, pipeline disputes, and regulatory uncertainty. Its producers were accustomed to adapting. Tariffs became another variable, not an existential threat. In contrast, U.S. policymakers underestimated how little flexibility existed in energy supply chains. Canada supplies more crude oil to the United States than any other country by a wide margin. This is not easily replaced by imports from overseas without logistical, political, and economic costs. Energy security arguments that justified tariffs in other sectors did not translate cleanly to oil and gas. As tariffs persisted, pressure mounted from U.S. industry groups. Manufacturers, refiners, and agricultural producers warned that higher costs were eroding competitiveness. Farmers faced retaliation in export markets. Energy-intensive industries struggled to pass costs along without losing customers. Canada's response remained disciplined. Rather than escalating rhetorically, Canadian officials emphasized rules-based trade, existing agreements, and the mutual harm caused by tariffs. Alberta's government highlighted the province's role in supporting American energy security, framing itself not as an adversary, but as an indispensable partner. That framing mattered. Public opinion in key U.S. states softened. Governors and state-level officials lobbied Washington for relief. Business leaders pressed for exemptions. Over time, the political calculus shifted. Tariffs intended to project power instead exposed vulnerability. Alberta did not win in a dramatic sense. It did not force concessions through confrontation. Instead, it demonstrated that power in integrated economies often lies with those who supply what cannot easily be replaced. Energy is one of those things. As the situation evolved, negotiations replaced threats. Some tariffs were eased, exemptions were introduced. Trade agreements were revisited. The episode became a case study in the limits of unilateral economic pressure against deeply connected partners. For Alberta, the experience reinforced long-standing lessons. Diversification matters, but so does leverage. Infrastructure matters, but so does demand. When your product is foundational to another country's economy, power does not always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like quiet endurance. The broader implications extended beyond Canada. Other countries observed the episode closely. It highlighted how tariffs can misfire when applied to complex supply chains. It showed that economic nationalism has costs, even for large economies. And it demonstrated that allies with critical resources can shape outcomes without overt confrontation. In Washington, the episode fed into ongoing debates about trade policy. Some policymakers doubled down on protectionism. Others argued for more nuanced approaches that recognized interdependence. The energy relationship with Canada became a central example in those discussions. Alberta's role remained consistent. The province continued exporting, it continued investing, it continued negotiating pipeline access and market diversification. Tariffs became part of the background noise rather than the defining feature of the relationship. That outcome surprised many observers. The expectation was that tariffs would force quick concessions. Instead, they revealed structural realities that limited their effectiveness. Power did not flow in the direction policymakers expected. The lesson was clear. In modern economies, leverage comes from position, not posture. Alberta's position in North American energy markets gave it resilience that tariffs could not easily undermine. As global energy markets continue to evolve, that resilience will remain critical. The US and Canada will continue to disagree on trade. Tariffs may return in new forms. Political rhetoric will rise and fall. But the underlying reality remains unchanged. Energy ties bind these economies together in ways that policy cannot easily sever. Tariffs backfired not because Canada struck back aggressively, but because the system itself resisted disruption. And in that system, Alberta holds real power. Thanks for watching Alert 360 News, where real stories meet real impact. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, smash that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the fastest growing news community on YouTube.